"Uncle, she's meeting that man again." Those words, whispered by a 3-year-old housekeeper's daughter at 3 in the morning, stopped Vincent Moretti cold. Not because he heard them clearly. He did, but because his brain refused to accept them. 11 days before his wedding, and the child had just seen something behind a half-closed door that his own eyes had missed for 2 years. Vincent Moretti was 39 years old. He was one of the 3 most powerful men on the East Coast. Not the kind of powerful that lands on magazine covers. No, his power was the silent type. The kind that moved cargo ships, settled contracts, and decided fates from Boston to Miami without ever making a sound in the press. He had inherited the Moretti Empire 15 years earlier, the night his father took a bullet meant for someone else. In those 15 years, Vincent didn't just hold on to what his father built. He multiplied it 7 times over. Through bloody dock wars, through midnight negotiations that no lawyer would ever put on paper, through decisions made in rooms where one wrong word meant a body bag. The newspapers, when they dared to whisper his name, called him the Shadow Tycoon. His rivals, the ones who knew him better than any journalist ever could, called him something else behind closed doors, the wolf who never forgets. Both names fit. Only one of them ever made him proud. He was tall, taller than people expected when he walked into a room. His face was angular, carved by years of hard choices rather than shaped by good fortune. A man who had learned early that gentleness was a luxury he couldn't afford. His eyes were gray, and they never blinked during negotiations. It was a habit so consistent that his enemies had come to fear the man who showed no strain. On his left cheekbone, a faint scar ran so thin it disappeared in dim light. Only 3 people alive knew how he got it, during an ambush when he was 24. 2 of them worked for him. The 3rd had died in that same ambush. But here's the thing the mansion staff whispered about more than anything else. Vincent Moretti did not smile. Almost 3 years had passed since anyone under his roof had seen his mouth curve upward without effort. The cooks and drivers spoke of it the way old sailors spoke of weather that hadn't broken in months, with that quiet unease of people waiting for something to shift. After 15 years of betrayal, intrigue, and gunfire, Vincent was tired. Not the physical kind of tired. He could still command his body like a soldier, but the deeper exhaustion that comes when a man has spent too many years suspecting everyone he touches. He wanted something real. Not another alliance. Not another deal. Something that couldn't be measured in ledgers. That was why, 2 years earlier, when he met Elena Hart at a charity gala, he allowed himself, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, to believe in destiny. In 11 days, the wedding would take place in the grand hall of the Moretti estate. 300 guests, mafia bosses from the East Coast, real estate magnates, 2 sitting senators, a retired federal judge. The alliance would secure the Moretti position for another 2 decades. That Vincent believed he had calculated every possible scenario his life could throw at him. But he hadn't prepared for the one sleeping in the room next to his. He hadn't prepared for a smile so perfect that the perfection itself should have been a warning. Elena Hart was 30 years old, and she was the kind of woman rooms rearranged themselves for. She had founded a small but respected charity fund for underprivileged children 3 years before meeting Vincent. She ran it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. Elegant, soft-spoken, she had a gift Vincent had never encountered in any negotiation. The ability to say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, without ever seeming to have rehearsed it. She never asked about his work. She never asked for gifts, cars, or property. When he offered, she declined more often than she accepted. And when she did accept, it was always something modest, a book, a scarf, a weekend at a small inn by the coast. To a man who had spent 15 years watching people calculate his net worth before they calculated his character, this restraint wasn't restraint. It was proof. Proof that she loved him, not the empire he stood on. They had met 2 years earlier at a charity gala in Manhattan. Vincent had only attended because his advisor, Marcus Duca, insisted the event mattered politically. He remembered that moment perfectly. Elena walked over to the champagne bar where he stood alone, waited a polite second, and said her first words to him. "You don't look like the things the newspapers write about you." Vincent, who had heard the opening lines of hundreds of women, practiced ones, ambitious ones, expensive ones, had no immediate answer. For the first time in his adult life, he just looked at her. She smiled and walked away. He found her again before the night ended. The 2 years that followed had been the slowest and softest of his life. There were mornings he lingered in bed, which had never happened before. There were weekends she planned herself, a lake house, a quiet vineyard, a bookstore town in Vermont. And he found himself, to his quiet surprise, following her instructions without checking them. She remembered the anniversary of his father's death every year and placed white lilies on the grave without telling him. He only discovered it the third time because the cemetery caretaker mentioned it in passing. When he tried to thank her, she simply said, "He was your father. It was the least I could do." She never once asked about the other work. Not the ports, not the men, not the names that came and went from the mansion at odd hours. That silence was its own kind of tenderness. And Vincent felt, perhaps for the first time, loved as a man rather than as a symbol. When she suggested they keep their finances separate until after the wedding, he took it as maturity. Tonight, before he went to his room, Elena had kissed him lightly on the forehead, whispered, "I love you," and walked to her own bedroom. They had slept separately for 2 months now at her request, for what she called tradition before the wedding. Vincent had never heard of that tradition, but he respected it. There are things so perfect that the perfection itself is the warning. Vincent Moretti had never trusted perfection in a negotiation. He hadn't asked himself why he trusted it in love. That on the other side of the mansion, far from the perfumed silence of Elena's wing, the western corridor breathed a different kind of quiet. The quiet of working hands finally at rest, of small lives packed into small rooms, of a woman who had learned to sleep lightly, because sleeping deeply was a luxury for people whose children were older. Grace Collins was 34 years old. She had served as resident housekeeper of the Moretti estate for a little over 3 years. Her husband had died of pancreatic cancer 3.5 years earlier in a hospital bed she couldn't afford, leaving behind a mountain of unpaid medical bills and a daughter who had just learned to walk. Grace buried him on a Tuesday and started applying for live-in domestic work by Thursday. She had no siblings in the city, no parents living, no illusions about what a single mother could survive on part-time wages. She was the only staff member in the mansion's history whom Vincent allowed to live on the estate with her child. It was an exception without precedent, and the older employees still spoke of it in low voices. The reason had unfolded in a single moment during her interview 3 years earlier. Her file had been approved on every line except one, the presence of a small child. Marcus Duca recommended they tell her no. Vincent asked to meet her anyway as she walked into his study, folded her hands in her lap, and looked him directly in the eye. "Sir," she said, "if you cannot allow my daughter to live with me, I will still take the job. But my daughter needs a mother every night. I will find a way." Vincent, who had spent his life surrounded by men who spoke with more force and less meaning, had never heard anyone speak to him in that tone before. He approved her application that same afternoon. 3 years later, Grace remained the quietest housekeeper on the estate, the most efficient, the most invisible when invisibility was needed, and always present when work required her. She had never asked Vincent for anything since the day she was hired. Lily was 3 years old. She had chestnut brown curls that refused every clip her mother tried, and round hazel eyes that seemed to record everything they saw. She had grown up in the mansion. The pastry cooks slipped her small cakes, the gate guards waved at her every morning, and she knew the names of every bird in the garden from an old picture book Grace had bought secondhand. She had a memory that was, even her mother had to admit, unusual for her age. She could name every car that had ever passed through the gate. She knew what hour Vincent came home each night. She could recognize the voice of every visitor who had ever stepped inside the mansion, even though she had heard only once. Lily had one particular habit. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, she would wake up thirsty, climb out of her small bed, and pad quietly down the hallway to the main kitchen. She preferred the taste of water from the large brass faucet to the water in the pitcher beside her room. Grace had tried for 2 years to break the habit and eventually gave up, only keeping the hallway lights on a low dim. In a mansion built by fear, there lived a 3-year-old girl who didn't know what fear was. Tonight, that not knowing would save an empire. 3 in the morning. Lily woke as she always did, without any adult reason. She rubbed her eyes with the back of one small hand, slid down from her bed, and stepped into her gray woolen socks. In her other arm, she carried Bun Bun, the stuffed rabbit that had lost one glass eye a year ago and had been loved harder ever since. She didn't turn on any light. She didn't need to. Her feet knew the way that the mansion at 3 in the morning was a different creature from the mansion at 3 in the afternoon. The ceilings looked higher. The dim wall lamps cast long shadows on the polished floors. From the tall walls, the oil-painted portraits of the Moretti generations looked down, grandfathers with mustaches, grandmothers in black lace, uncles who had died before Lily was born. To an adult, those faces held history and warning. To Lily, they were simply pictures. She was 3 years old. She didn't yet know that faces on walls could be dangerous. She hummed a small, tuneless song under her breath as she walked, Bun Bun swinging gently against her hip, following the familiar path toward the back staircase that led down to the great kitchen. At the same moment, on a different floor of the same house, Vincent Moretti was also awake. He had risen at 3 for as long as he could remember, a habit inherited from the years of family war when sleeping meant dying. Tonight he had gone down to the kitchen himself, poured a glass of cold water, and started back toward his room by way of the east corridor, the long carpeted passage that ran past his private study, a route he had walked 10,000 times. He heard it before he saw anything. A whisper. Vincent stopped. His private study at 3 in the morning should have held no one. He set the glass of water silently on the edge of a side table and pressed his back to the wall beside the door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap of light, 2 voices came clearly to him. One belonged to a young man he didn't recognize. The other belonged to Elena. If he finds out before the wedding, everything collapses. Elena's voice, low and controlled, the voice of someone who had made this argument before. "You told me you had more time than this." The man answered. "I have time," Elena said. "He trusts me completely. That's the entire point of the plan." Vincent, the man who had conducted hundreds of negotiations where a single word decided who lived, who had read the smallest twitches on the faces of his enemies, who had survived 3 assassination attempts before his 30th birthday, suddenly could not move. It wasn't fear. His body was still trying to translate what his ears had received, and his mind hadn't yet given permission for that translation to be understood. He stood there, one hand resting flat against the wall, his heart beating slower than it should have, almost unnaturally slow. Inside his head, 2 years of memories began rewinding without invitation. The champagne bar, the white lilies on his father's grave, the whispered, "I love you," only an hour before. There are moments in a man's life when he would rather die than hear the next sentence. Vincent Moretti had just entered such a moment, and fate had arranged that he wouldn't walk through it alone at that exact moment. Lily turned the corner at the end of the east corridor, coming back from the great kitchen with a small glass of water held carefully in both hands. She was walking slowly so as not to spill. Bun Bun hung from the crook of her arm by one soft ear. She saw him first. Uncle Vincent, the tall man she had only ever seen from a distance across the garden or through a doorway. Her mother had told her many times that she should always greet him politely, but she must never disturb him. Lily wasn't disturbing him now. She was simply passing on her way back to bed, and she saw behind him the thin bar of light spilling out from the half-open door of the study. She heard from inside that light the whispering voice of Miss Elena with the clarity that only a 3-year-old can afford, as she looked up at him and said the words that would rearrange the rest of his life. "Uncle, she's meeting that man again." Vincent looked down at her. His heart was beating in a place he could no longer feel. He forced his voice into a shape that wouldn't frighten a child. "Again?" he asked softly. "You've seen this before," Lily nodded. The natural nod of a child telling something the adults had asked her to hide, without ever explaining to her why hiding was necessary. "Many times," she said. "When you go to work, Miss Elena said it was a secret game. She gives me candy every time I don't tell." Vincent's hand closed slowly at his hip, so slowly no observer would have caught it. Inside the study, the whispering stopped. 3 seconds of silence pressed against the door like a held breath. Then the door opened. Elena stepped out first. She wore a pale blue silk robe. Her phone was still in her hand. Her expression settled into perfect calm faster than any human expression should have been able to settle. A calm so complete that Vincent, who had read the faces of enemies for a living, noted somewhere at the back of his mind that her performance was flawless. Behind her, a young man Vincent had never seen stepped into the corridor. He looked no older than 28. His clothes were casual, wrong for a mansion at 3 in the morning. He had the awkward, poorly hidden posture of a man who had just been caught. "Vincent, darling, why are you up so early?" Elena's voice was still sweet, still natural, as though she were about to offer him breakfast rather than an explanation for a stranger in his private study. Vincent didn't answer her. He looked past her, straight at the young man. The young man dropped his eyes toward the carpet. That was the first detail Vincent filed away. Lily, still not sensing the weight in the air, lifted her glass of water proudly toward Vincent. "I got my water," she announced. 2 floors below, Grace Collins snapped awake in her small room. She had heard voices in the hallway upstairs, and the maternal instinct that had kept her alert through 3 years of single motherhood pulled her out of bed within 3 seconds. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from the enemy outside the gate. It comes from the voice you believed you would hear every night for the rest of your life, and from a door you never thought would need a lock. Grace ran up the back staircase 2 steps at a time, arriving at the top of the east corridor still in her nightgown, her hair loose over her shoulders. She saw them all at once. Vincent standing very still, Lily holding her small glass of water, Elena in her pale blue robe, and the young stranger a step behind her. The air between them so thick that Grace stopped breathing for a moment before her instincts caught up. She rushed forward, scooped Lily into her arms, and began apologizing in a rapid, breathless whisper. "Sir, I am so sorry." She wandered again. "I'll keep her in her room from now on. Please, I beg you, don't send us away." Elena, holding the calm of a hostess introducing a guest at a dinner party, spoke before Vincent could reply. "This is Nathan, an old friend from my university years. He's going through some financial trouble and needed advice. I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier, darling. He was too embarrassed to come during the day." The story was smooth in the way only rehearsed stories are smooth. Short, emotional, not too perfect, humble enough to sound true. Any man who hadn't heard the whispered words behind the door would have believed it entirely. Vincent nodded slowly. He didn't speak to her. He looked at Nathan and said quietly, "It's late. I'll have the driver take you home." Nathan nodded, avoiding his eyes again, and was led away by 2 silent guards who had materialized in the hallway without a sound. Elena waited for Vincent to say something more, to ask a question, to reach for her hand. He did none of those things. He simply turned and walked back toward his own bedroom without looking at her. Elena stayed alone in the corridor. For the first time in 2 years, she couldn't read the man she was about to marry in his room. Vincent didn't turn on any light. He sat in the armchair by the window and looked out at the city glittering below the estate. Inside his mind, 2 years began to play in slow motion under a new and colder light, the way Elena had always booked his flights herself, so I can take care of you the right way. The way she always laid her phone face down on the table. A habit from the fund, she'd said. The way she had suggested keeping their finances separate until after the wedding, to keep things simple. The way 6 months ago she had proposed replacing his driver, a family friend, more trustworthy, she'd claimed. Every small kindness he had accepted as love now had edges he hadn't seen before. Every gesture he had once cherished now fit into a shape he didn't want to name. In the small servant's room downstairs, Grace held Lily, who had already fallen back asleep against her shoulder. Her heart beat unevenly. For 3 years, she had lived in fear of a secret she had chosen to carry. Tonight, when her daughter had unknowingly spoken a fragment of that secret aloud, she understood that God was offering her a final chance to choose between silence and truth. She kissed her daughter's hair and knew what she had avoided for 3 years. She could avoid no longer. Some nights are no longer than others in hours, but some nights are long enough to change an entire life. Inside the Moretti mansion that night, 3 such nights were happening at once under a single roof. 7 in the morning. Grace knocked on the door of Vincent's study with her free hand, the other supporting Lily, who was asleep on her shoulder. Her knuckles trembled against the wood. Vincent opened the door himself. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't changed his shirt. In the 3 years Grace had worked at the estate, she had never once seen him in that condition. He nodded her inside without a word. She carried Lily to the small reading chair in the corner of the room and settled her into it with a bird picture book pressed into her sleeping hands. Then she turned to face Vincent with the steadiness of a woman who had rehearsed this sentence in her head 100 times over the course of 6 months. "Sir, 6 months ago, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and I stayed silent because I was afraid. If you wish to dismiss me after you hear what I have to say, I will understand. But last night, when my daughter said those words without knowing what they meant, I understood that I had hidden long enough. I must speak. Vincent gestured toward the chair across from his desk. She sat. She told him that a late afternoon in Miss Elena's dressing room, cleaning as usual. Elena's tablet had been left open on the vanity, its screen still bright. Grace hadn't been snooping. She had been drying the surface of the table with a soft cloth when the title of the open document stopped her eyes. Moretti Asset Transfer Plan. Contingency Clause 7C. Beside the document, a thread of messages with someone named Nathan Cole referenced a company called Meridian Trust and something the messages simply called the plan after day X. Grace hadn't understood every word. She had understood enough to know it wasn't the kind of thing a woman wrote about the man she was about to marry that Elena had walked in and caught her standing there. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't shown anger. That was the part Grace had never forgotten. The calm was the frightening part. Elena had smiled, closed the tablet, sat down at the mirror, and spoken in that same soft voice she used with everyone. Grace, I remember great-grandmother Moretti's pearls are in my cabinet. If one day they were to disappear, and I had to tell Vincent that you were the last person with a key, who do you think he would believe? Grace had no family in the city, no home to return to. Only Lily. She had said nothing. But she took a photograph in secret, her voice tightening as she explained. She lifted her phone, opened a hidden folder, and held the screen out toward Vincent. I didn't know what I would ever do with it. I only knew that if one day I needed to prove I hadn't imagined it, I would have it. Vincent took the phone. Before he looked at the screen, Grace spoke the last line she had prepared. My daughter knows nothing. Please don't let her be dragged into this. That's the only thing I ask. Vincent nodded slowly, with a seriousness she had never seen on any face before. Then he looked at the screen that Vincent Moretti had once believed courage was a thing possessed only by men who carried weapons. This morning, in his own study, he relearned that definition from an empty-handed, trembling, and entirely correct woman. He looked at the screen of Grace's phone. The blood in his veins seemed to slow, as if his body had decided that whatever he was about to see required stillness in order to be survived. It wasn't merely a chain of messages. It was a photograph of a draft contract page with his own name printed clearly at the top, referencing the transfer of the entire operating shareholding of Moretti Holdings Group, the family's legal logistics conglomerate, into a legal entity called Meridian Trust LLC. The transfer was to take effect upon completion of the marriage, in accordance with Succession Clause 7C of the prenuptial agreement. Clause 7C. Vincent remembered it. An old contingency clause originally drafted by the family lawyer, Marcus Duca, 14 years earlier for a different relationship, one that had ended long before it ever reached an altar. The clause stated that if the husband lost mental capacity or died within 5 years of the marriage, the wife would have the right to assume the operating leadership of the legal conglomerate without the approval of the family council. Vincent had resigned that clause with Elena without reading it carefully. Because he trusted her. Because he was tired of doubting every person who touched him. Because he wanted just once in his life to allow himself the luxury of belief. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, keeping his back to Grace for several seconds so she wouldn't see his face. 3 years earlier, he had believed the worst thing a man could discover was that his wife had betrayed him. This morning, he learned there was something worse by 1 degree. The discovery that his future wife had never been a future wife at all. Only a role in a play still waiting for its final act. He turned back. His voice, when it came, was low and unnaturally steady. The voice he used when signing $300 million contracts. Grace, you will not lose your job. You will not lose anything. From this moment forward, you and Lily are under my complete protection. But I need you to tell me every detail you can remember. Every phone call. Every name. Every date. In 4 hours, I have a meeting with the people I trust absolutely. I don't believe we're only canceling a wedding. I believe we're stopping a murder that has been planned for years. Grace turned pale. She had never once thought of the word murder. She had thought of betrayal, of money, of power. Those were the words she had rehearsed in her head at night for 6 months. But now, hearing Vincent speak the harder word in the calmest voice she had ever heard from any man, she understood that the secret she had carried was many times larger than she had allowed herself to imagine. In the corner of the room, Lily stirred slightly in her sleep, murmuring something into the fur of Bun Bun's remaining ear. And Grace realized with a jolt that her daughter had been walking around inside a house where someone was preparing a slow death. Yet there are mornings when a man wakes up as a man in love. Vincent Moretti woke this morning as a man on a hunt, and he had just understood that his prey had been hunting him first for 2 full years. 10 in the morning. The secret conference room beneath the mansion, a place Elena had never once been permitted to enter. A place whose door opened only by fingerprint and a rotating 6-digit code. For people sat around a long walnut table. Marcus Duca, 62 years old, chief legal counsel to the Moretti family since Vincent's father's time. He wore his gold-rimmed glasses low on his nose. In 40 years of practice, he had never raised his voice. And this morning, he didn't intend to break that habit. Sofia Reyes, 38, head of Moretti Intelligence, former military intelligence officer. She sat with her short-cropped hair still slightly damp from the shower she had taken after Vincent's 4 a.m. call. She had the eyes of a woman who could still identify by face someone she had watched for 6 days a decade ago. Rocco Biensi, chief of personal security, broad-shouldered and quiet. He had taken 2 bullets meant for Vincent in his lifetime, and would take a third without discussion. And Vincent at the head of the table. He placed the printed enlargement of Grace's photograph on the wood. He offered no explanation. For 20 minutes, no one spoke. Marcus put his glasses on and read very slowly. His hands didn't tremble, but his mouth pressed thin, the only sign in a man who had witnessed 4 decades of family history that he was stunned. Sophia typed Meridian Trust into her laptop and began sweeping the underground databases that only 3 organizations in the world possessed access to. Rocco sat perfectly still, aware that his part of the work hadn't yet begun. Marcus spoke first. His voice remained calm, but it carried the weight of a man who had understood the whole of the problem before he had finished reading it. Clause 7C is not in isolation a problem. It's standard contingency language, but paired with a legal entity prepositioned to receive the shares after the wedding, and with a medical file that I believe we will discover exists. This is not a matter of the heart, Vincent. This is architecture. Someone has read your prenuptial agreement more carefully than you did. Vincent nodded. He didn't speak. 15 minutes later, Sophia looked up from her screen. I have 4 names and 1 money trail. Meridian Trust was registered 9 months ago in Delaware. The listed director is a 26-year-old paralegal, a complete figurehead who is simultaneously the registered agent for 11 other shell entities. But the money, I traced it through 2 shell companies, an account in Grand Cayman, and a private trust in Zurich. All leads back to a single name. She rotated the laptop toward Vincent. On the screen, the photograph of a man of about 60, silver hair combed smooth to one side, a composed and unremarkable smile, the eyes of someone who had spent a very long time sitting still. Vincent read the name printed beneath the photograph for 3 seconds. No one in the room breathed. Marcus removed his glasses. Sophia sat back in her chair. Rocco, who almost never reacted to anything, allowed one small motion. His hand closed around the edge of the table. If there are names the underworld has not spoken in 20 years. Not because the man who bore them has died, but because he was wise enough to disappear until no one remembered his face, and then to come back precisely when his old enemy finally had children to protect. Adrian Blackwood. It was a name Vincent's father had spoken only once in his entire life. On a winter night when Vincent was 14, and his father had drunk too much brandy after the funeral of an old friend. The old man had stared into the fireplace, not at his son, and said in a voice slower than usual, "There are enemies who don't shoot at you. They wait. Adrian is a waiter. If one day you hear that name come back, remember that he has been waiting 20 years to say it to you." He had never spoken the name again. 20 years earlier, Vincent's father had defeated Adrian Blackwood in the war for control of the East Coast ports. A war that lasted 18 months, cost 37 lives, ended with Adrian losing his territory, his younger brother, most of his fortune, and finally his presence in the city. Everyone had assumed he was dead. Everyone had been wrong. Sophia laid out the updated file across the walnut table. Adrian hadn't died. He hadn't disintegrated. He had withdrawn to a small suburb outside Philadelphia, adopted a new legal name for the first 10 years, and rebuilt himself from nothing. but this time through entirely legitimate enterprises. Commercial real estate, education trust funds, 3 mid-sized private hospitals. For 15 straight years, not one of his ventures had touched the underworld. Adrian had learned the single greatest lesson of his defeat. If you can't win with a gun, win with time. For years ago, when Vincent had assumed full command of the Moretti Empire after his father's death and began to expand it aggressively, Adrian started to move again. He didn't attack directly. He had tried that once, 20 years earlier, and lost everything. He chose a girl instead. Elena Hart, the daughter of a former accountant who had once worked for the Blackwood family before going bankrupt during the Port War 2 decades ago. A family that had lost everything because of Vincent's father and had never once forgiven the Morettis for it. Sophia produced the documents. Elena had been sent to Europe at the age of 26, ostensibly to study fund management at an institute in Zurich. In reality, she had spent 4 years being trained by a small circle of specialists, psychologists, behavioral analysts, communication coaches, all quietly part of Adrian's larger network. That Elena wasn't a woman whose tastes happened to align with Vincent's. She had been designed against Vincent's psychological profile, a profile Adrian had secretly assembled over the 2 years preceding her introduction into his life. Her musical preferences, her conversational rhythm, the way she reacted when Vincent grew silent with anger, even the first line she had spoken at the champagne bar. All of it had been programmed. Vincent closed his eyes. He remembered the first time Elena had asked him about his mother, a woman he almost never mentioned. She had waited for the right moment, the right bottle of wine, the right rainy night. He had thought at the time it was a woman's intuition. This morning, he understood it had been dated. There are enemies who lose a battle and return a week later with more guns. And there are enemies who lose a battle and return 20 years later with someone else's daughter, programmed to love you. Adrian Blackwood was the second kind. Sophia opened a second folder on the table. The file of the young man Vincent had seen the previous night in the corridor. Nathan Cole, 28 years old, a finance graduate from a mid-tier state university, 6 years at a middling investment fund, where no colleague had ever thought of him as particularly ambitious or particularly incompetent. Until 9 months ago, when his personal bank account had begun receiving payments that his salary couldn't explain, payments whose timing lined up exactly with the registration of Meridian Trust. Sophia slid a fresh photograph across the walnut table. This is the detail you weren't given last night. Nathan Cole is not Elena's lover in any sense we can find. No late-night calls with romantic content. No private text threads. No hotel bookings. He is Adrian Blackwood's nephew, the son of Adrian's younger sister, who took her maiden name back after the Port War 20 years ago, precisely so no one could trace the bloodline. Elena and Nathan were not a couple hiding an affair. They were 2 employees of the same man, meeting at 3 in the morning to exchange updates on the plan. Vincent sat very still. When he spoke, his voice was steady the way a surgeon's voice is steady when he first sees the extent of internal damage. So Elena is not deceiving me through emotional betrayal. She is running a military operation inside my house. Nathan is the courier. Elena is the field commander. Adrian is the general. Sophia nodded once. Exactly. And Nathan is the weakest link. He's young, inexperienced. He's been spending too visibly for the past 3 months, including a new Porsche entirely inconsistent with his reported salary. If we apply pressure at the right point, he will speak. Marcus offered the next piece of the picture, which was in its own quieter way the most disturbing. Elena's financial history over the past 3 years shows regular income from a small private trust based in Zurich. That trust was registered 4 years ago, which means Elena Hart was on Adrian's payroll before she ever met you at the charity gala. Furthermore, that gala was partially sponsored by a shell company linked to Adrian's real estate network. Your entire fateful encounter, Vincent, was a staged event with an operating budget. Vincent exhaled slowly through his nose. Inside his head, the 2 years of the relationship played backward like a film run in reverse. Elena's first smile at the champagne bar. Her first sentence, "You don't look like the things the newspapers write about you." He had believed at the time it was the intuition of a woman who could see through men. This morning he understood it was a piece of dialogue. Page 1 of a script written in Zurich 4 years earlier by a man he had never met, but whose face he now knew. Rocco finally spoke, his voice low and cold. The voice of a man who had been waiting for permission. "Boss, do we finish her tonight?" Vincent didn't answer immediately. He looked out through the narrow, ground-level window that faced the eastern garden. Grace was walking Lily along the gravel path in the sunlight. The little girl was pointing at a small brown sparrow that had landed on the top of the low garden wall. And she was laughing, the pure, open laugh only a 3-year-old can produce. There are fast ways of revenge, and there are correct ways of revenge. Vincent Moretti had never chosen the fast way. Tonight, in the most painful hour of his life, he didn't intend to choose it either. Vincent asked Sophia to dig deeper. If Adrian's plan was to have Elena inherit the legal conglomerate after the marriage, then there had to be a middle step. Vincent had to die or lose his capacity within the 5-year window specified by Clause 7C. Adrian wouldn't have built a machine this elaborate and left the trigger to chance. 4 hours later, Sophia returned to the underground room with a slim file. It contained a list of pharmaceuticals ordered through an international pharmacy over the preceding 6 months by Elena's private physician, Dr. Reinhardt, a distinguished-looking man of 60 whom Elena had introduced to Vincent 1 year earlier under the description of the most trusted family doctor in Zurich. One item on the list was marked in red, pure aconitine at low dosage. Sophia set the file down and spoke without inflection. Aconitine is extracted from the monkshood plant. In low cumulative doses, it's nearly undetectable in a standard blood panel. It produces a progressive weakening of the heart that mimics natural cardiac disease over a period of 6 to 9 months. She paused, then continued. At this dosage, it won't kill you quickly, sir. It will make your heart fail slowly. 6 months after the wedding, you'll notice shortness of breath at the gym. 9 months in, you'll receive a diagnosis of undetected hereditary heart disease. 12 months, you'll die in a hospital bed with Dr. Reinhardt standing beside you, signing the death certificate himself. The last detail sent something cold down Vincent's spine. In the new life insurance policy Elena had helped him complete 3 months earlier. Because you never have the time, darling. Vincent had been listed as having a family history of cardiovascular disease. Vincent had no such history. His father had been shot. His mother died in a car accident. His grandfather died of lung disease. No Moretti in 3 generations had died of the heart. Someone had inserted a false medical history into his file, so that when he died 6 months into the marriage of what would appear to be a hereditary condition, no one would think to ask. Adrian Blackwood didn't want to kill a mafia boss. He wanted to kill a legend and let the world believe it had been fate. Marcus quietly folded his glasses and set them on the walnut table. In 40 years of practice, I have never seen a plan this meticulous. Vincent, this is not organized crime. This is long-term warfare with the budget of a small country. If Grace had not accidentally photographed that tablet 6 months ago, we would likely have discovered nothing until you had already signed the marriage register and drunk your first glass of champagne with aconitine in it. Vincent rose from his chair and walked to the narrow, ground-level window. In the eastern garden, Lily was running in small circles, holding a fallen yellow leaf above her head, laughing at nothing in particular. Grace stood a few steps away, watching her, a folded knit sweater in her arms in case her daughter grew cold. Vincent looked at the scene for a long time. He understood something simple. The woman who had saved his life wasn't Elena. It wasn't anyone he had trusted in the past 2 years. It was a tired mother standing in his garden with her 3-year-old daughter, and she didn't yet know whose life she had saved. Adrian Blackwood had spent 20 years calculating every variable. He had forgotten only one. A 3-year-old girl who liked to drink water at 3 in the morning. Vincent returned to the walnut table. The other 3 followed. Outside, Lily was still laughing in the garden. Inside, 3 separate proposals waited to be spoken. Rocco offered his second, this one blunter than the first. We handle Elena tonight. Quietly. We take Nathan before he can make a call. We move Adrian out of the country within the week. It ends this weekend. Marcus refused before Vincent could answer. Too much legal risk. If any of the 3 disappears before the wedding, the FBI will begin asking questions we can't control. Adrian is patient enough to have prepared an insurance file that redirects the entire narrative back onto us. We'd be defending ourselves for years. Sophia offered the third path. Then we hand the entire file to the FBI today. We cancel the wedding publicly, citing discovered financial fraud. We let the law handle it and step aside. Vincent shook his head at all three. His voice, when he spoke, had the low, contained calm of a man who had already decided, if I cancel the wedding today, Elena disappears within 4 hours. Nathan within 6. Adrian within 24. The man has already disappeared for 20 years once. He can disappear for 20 more. I don't want to stop this plan. I want to package it in full and deliver it in front of 300 witnesses on the day of the ceremony. I want the entire underworld to see Adrian walked out in handcuffs inside the very event he came to watch as his victory. Marcus pushed back. You are inviting a potential poisoner to remain in your house for additional days so that you may collect better evidence. Not in my bedroom, Vincent said. She has slept in her own room for 2 months on the pretext of cultural tradition before the wedding. I understand now why she was so firm on it. She didn't want to sleep beside the man she was preparing to poison. We have been waiting for the same event for 2 entirely different reasons. She waits to complete her legal inheritance. I wait to complete my evidence. He assigned tasks to each of them. Sophia would place listening devices in every room Elena used and monitor every meeting she took. She would trace Adrian's money down to its last vein and identify every operative in the network. Every meeting between Nathan and Adrian, if it occurred, would be filmed. Marcus would quietly rewrite Clause 7C to close its legal opening and prepare the evidentiary handoff to a senior FBI agent he had trusted for 2 decades, someone who would attend the wedding under the cover of an invited guest. Rocco would protect Grace and Lily. No one was to know they were witnesses. By day, life would look normal. By night, 3 concealed guards would rotate around the servants' quarters. If Elena or Nathan made any move that even suggested touching them, Rocco was authorized to act before the law was consulted. Rocco nodded once. This was the order he had been waiting for. Vincent closed the meeting. 300 guests will come. 300 bosses, businessmen, politicians. Adrian will come to watch. I want him in the 4th row. I want him to see me in my black suit. I want him to feel every minute of the ceremony. And when the officiant asks who objects, I want Adrian to understand that the man he has hunted for 2 years has just hunted him for 40 days. In the days remaining before the wedding, the Moretti estate would become the largest stage of a play only one man knew was being performed. The lead was not the bride. It was the groom. The next morning, Vincent walked into the dining room as if nothing in the world had changed. Elena was already at the table in her silk robe, a cup of coffee cradled in both hands. She looked up with a smile she had clearly rehearsed, worried, a little embarrassed, calibrated to the exact angle a fiancé would offer after being caught in something small. Darling, about last night. I'm sorry I didn't explain properly. Nathan is an old university friend of mine. He's going through a difficult divorce and needed advice about financial law. I lent him a small amount years ago, and I was too embarrassed to tell you because I was afraid you would think me foolish. The story was crafted with quiet precision, brief, self-deprecating, not too polished, humble enough to feel real. It was the kind of story a man who wanted to believe would believe. Vincent looked at her. For 2 seconds, he felt 2 things at once. The first was a strange, almost professional admiration for the composure of 4 years of training that had never once slipped. The second was a pain in the left side of his chest that he thought 15 years of family war had made permanently numb, a pain that returned suddenly, without invitation. He nodded, accepted the cup of coffee she had poured for him, a cup he wouldn't drink, since he had already arranged with the quiet help of a loyal server a discreet method of exchange, and said only, "You don't need to apologize. I understand." Elena exhaled softly. Vincent registered that exhale and stored it. It was the exhale of a woman who had been genuinely worried, not the exhale of someone celebrating a win. Not everything in her was false. A small part of her had loved him, or at least had grown used to him enough not to want to lose him before the wedding. That knowledge made the situation more difficult to carry, not easier. The days that followed unfolded in a suffocating kind of normalcy. Elena chose flowers, finalized the menu, tried her 3rd wedding gown at a designer's atelier in Manhattan. Vincent played the tired but happy groom. He held her every evening when they reviewed the seating chart in the drawing room. He smiled at family dinners. He carried a weight through it all that no one at any of those tables could see. Beneath the mansion, Sophia's team worked without stopping. Every call Elena made was recorded. Elena was careful, She never said anything openly on the phone, but the way she hinted to Nathan was enough for Sophia to reconstruct. Every meeting Nathan took was captured through 6 cameras placed in different Manhattan cafes. A transfer of $1,200,000 from Meridian Trust to Adrian's shell company in Zurich was photographed in full. A meeting between Nathan and Adrian in a suite at the Plaza Hotel, where Adrian had registered under a false name, was filmed by a device Sophia had disguised as room service equipment. Grace was told no additional details. Vincent wanted her to know as little as possible for her own protection, but Rocco quietly moved her and Lily to a set of rooms nearer the main kitchen, closer to the emergency exit. Grace didn't ask why. Lily was delighted. The new window looked out onto a part of the garden with many more birds. Marriage is a promise between 2 people. Inside the Moretti mansion during those 10 days, only one person was actually keeping his, and it wasn't the woman having her wedding gown fitted for the last time in Manhattan. The 6th day before the wedding, in the afternoon, Elena wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water and found Lily seated at the small side table with a new box of colored pencils Grace had bought her the previous week. The little girl was drawing 3 figures on a large sheet of white paper. A tall man in a black shirt, Uncle Vincent. A woman with long hair, Miss Elena. And a third man drawn standing apart from the other 2. Uncle Nathan. Elena stopped in the kitchen doorway for 5 full seconds. Then she stepped inside slowly, sat down across from Lily, and spoke in the sweet, measured voice she used with everyone she wanted to disarm. Lily, sweetheart, what a beautiful drawing. Did you show this one to Uncle Vincent? Lily nodded proudly. I told Uncle Vincent about Uncle Nathan already. Uncle Vincent asked me a lot of questions the other day. He's very kind. He gave me candy. The pencil in Elena's hand paused for half a second. She smiled, praised the drawing, praised Lily's cleverness, and stood up. The moment she left the kitchen, she reached for the phone in her pocket. She held it in her hand for 3 seconds. Then she put it away. She had trained for 4 years in Zurich. She knew that a single wrong call at this moment could unmake 4 years of work. She walked upstairs to her private room, sat down in front of the mirror, and began to think. But Sophia had already watched every step in the surveillance room beneath the mansion. She spoke into Vincent's earpiece within seconds. Vincent called Rocco. Within 40 minutes, a scene had been staged in careful detail. A senior guard walked into the kitchen wearing the deliberate irritation of a man interrupting a small breach of house rules. His voice was loud enough to travel. Lily, you are not allowed to draw strangers. Uncle Vincent doesn't like it when you imagine some Uncle Nathan. There is no Uncle Nathan in this house. Did you listen to your mother or not? It was loud enough that Elena, passing along the outer corridor on her way to the drawing room, heard every word. Grace appeared, genuinely confused and momentarily furious at the sight of her daughter being scolded over a drawing. But Rocco caught her elbow and drew her into a side hallway. He whispered 3 sentences. Grace stood still for 3 seconds. Then she understood the situation was larger than she had assumed. As she stepped back into the kitchen, scolded Lily gently in front of the guard, apologized profusely, and carried her daughter back to their room. Lily cried a little without understanding any of it. That night, Elena sent a message to Nathan through an encrypted app that Sophia had already cracked 2 weeks earlier. The child truly knows nothing. Just child's play. And the mother doesn't watch her carefully. Handled. We are safe. Vincent read that line in his study at 11 at night. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something worse. When an enemy writes, "We are safe," it means they have grown comfortable enough not to see who the actually safe person in the house is. He called Rocco. From now until the wedding, 5 guards around Grace's quarters, not 3. If Adrian has something I haven't seen, he will move against the child before he moves against me. He also called Grace up to his study, apologized for the morning's staged scolding, explained that it had been necessary, and promised her that after the wedding, neither she nor Lily would ever have to pretend again that the killer who fears most is not the strongest. It is the one who remembers every detail he has already forgotten, he once revealed. 10 in the evening. The night before the wedding, Vincent stood alone on the 3rd-floor balcony overlooking the garden that had been prepared for 300 guests. String lights wound around the old cypresses. White roses arranged in tall frames along the aisle. The long banquet tables covered in ivory linen. On the main stage, an altar of Italian marble imported for the ceremony itself. Adrian Blackwood had confirmed his attendance under the description of an old friend of the Hart family, a spiritual uncle who had watched Elena grow up. He would be seated in the fourth row, the section reserved for the bride's relatives. 300 formal guests. 60 reporters gathered outside the gates. 12 of the most celebrated chefs in the city. A symphony orchestra of 42 musicians. Sophia climbed the small side staircase and stepped onto the balcony beside him. She handed Vincent a small encrypted USB drive. Inside it lay the entire case arranged into a 7-minute presentation. The audio recording of the 3 in the morning conversation, the flow of money from Meridian Trust to Zurich, the pharmaceutical order for aconitine, the falsified medical file with its invented cardiac history, the draft share transfer contract, the photographs of Nathan and Adrian at the Plaza Suite 3 weeks earlier, the Zurich training records covering 4 years of Elena's life, and the archival evidence of the connection between Elena's family and the Blackwood organization 2 decades earlier. Enough to send all 3 of them to prison for 15 to 25 years. A copy had already been delivered to FBI agent Miriam Torres, a senior investigator in the Mafia division whom Marcus had trusted for 20 years. She would attend the wedding under the cover of a high-end photography magazine reporter, together with 6 other agents disguised as catering staff and hotel security. Inside the mansion, 20 Moretti guards would work the ceremony as official servers. If any Blackwood-side weapon movement occurred, Rocco's team was authorized to act first. Sophia asked quietly, "Are you certain you want to do this publicly? In front of 300 people, we can still take Adrian tonight when he returns to his hotel." Vincent looked down at the garden for a long moment. "My father defeated Adrian in the dark 20 years ago. Adrian came back in the dark 4 years ago. If I end this in the dark again, 10 years from now, another man will come in the dark. I need the entire underworld to see it. I need Adrian to sit in the 4th row and watch his 4-year plan collapse in 4 minutes. In front of the 20 bosses he was hoping would welcome him back into the city tomorrow morning." Sophia nodded once and went back down the staircase. Vincent stood alone. He took out his phone and called Grace. "Tomorrow, you and Lily will sit in the 2nd row, the section for the groom's family. I know you will feel uncomfortable, but please don't refuse. The 2 of you are the 2 people I most want to be present." Grace didn't understand, but she agreed. In the small servants' quarters, Lily was already asleep, one arm curled around Bun Bun. Grace sat beside her daughter, gently smoothing her hair, unaware that tomorrow would be the day her life and her daughter's life would change forever. There are last nights of an old life whose owner never knows they were the last. Inside the Moretti mansion that night, for such lives slept beneath a single roof. 2 who would lose everything, and 2 who would be given everything back at the morning of the wedding. The Moretti estate was overrun with waiters, florists, and chefs before the sun had fully risen. 300 guests began arriving at 11. The largest bosses of the East Coast underworld, real estate magnates, 2 sitting senators, 1 retired federal judge, 3 directors of international investment funds. Television cameras were forbidden. This was a private ceremony. Only the family's own photographer was permitted to move among the seats. Elena appeared at exactly 12. Her wedding gown was 5 meters of white silk designed privately in Paris. Her hair was pinned up in the classical style. Around her neck, she wore only 1 ornament, the Moretti great-grandmother's string of pearls, the very strand she had once used 6 months earlier to threaten Grace into silence as she descended the grand staircase of the Great Hall. 300 people rose and applauded. She was beautiful with a completeness that would have been suspicious in any other context. Vincent, standing at the head of the aisle in a black suit tailored in Milan, noted quietly to himself that this was the final performance of 4 years of training. Grace and Lily sat in the 2nd row. Grace wore the simple, deep blue dress Vincent had sent her that morning. Lily wore a small white dress and clutched Bun Bun tightly. Because Grace hadn't had the courage to make her leave him behind, Adrian Blackwood sat in the 4th row on the bride's side. Silver hair combed smooth, gray suit, a wine-red necktie, a cane resting against his knee. He looked like a retired gentleman of 60. He smiled at those around him. He told the story of his spiritual niece Elena, whom he had watched grow up. No one doubted a word of it. Nathan Cole sat 3 rows behind him, Deliberately far, deliberately unremarkable, the officiant, Monsignor Antonio Rossi, the parish priest who had baptized Vincent 40 years earlier, stepped onto the altar. Elena took her place beside Vincent. The two of them turned to face each other. Vincent looked directly into Elena's eyes. For half a second, he saw something strange there, a small flicker of doubt. She was the second-best reader of people he had ever met, after Sophia. She could feel that something was wrong. She couldn't identify what. It was already too late to withdraw. The officiant began the traditional homily on sacred union, on love, on two families joining. Adrian in the fourth row nodded in appreciation. Grace's hand closed tightly around Lily's small fingers. The officiant reached the significant line. If anyone in this hall has reason to object to this marriage, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. The customary silence followed. 300 people smiled. It was a phrase no one ever expected to be used in earnest. Vincent stepped forward half a step. I do. The hall stopped. Elena turned her face toward him. Her smile was still in place. Her eyes had already frozen. Adrian Blackwood straightened his spine in the fourth row, the first time in 20 years that a Blackwood had lost control of his own expression. Vincent turned to face the 300 guests. His voice was not loud, but the hall had been designed with perfect acoustics. Every word carried to the back row like the sound of a bronze bell. 20 years ago, a man named Adrian Blackwood lost a war of power against my father. He didn't die. He didn't surrender. He waited. For years ago, he began building a plan that didn't use guns and didn't use threats. He built a woman. There are historical moments that only those who are in the right place get to witness. The 300 people in the Moretti Hall that day didn't know until later, when they retold it, that they had just witnessed the ending of a war that had begun before most of them were born. Vincent continued in the same calm voice, and the entire hall held its breath. The Elena Hart you see standing beside me today is not the woman I believed I loved for 2 years. She is the product of 4 years of training in Zurich, designed against my measured psychological profile, and delivered into my life through a charity gala partly financed by a shell company belonging to Adrian Blackwood. She has signed a confidential contract with a legal entity called Meridian Trust, whose registered representative is Adrian's own nephew. Their plan after today's ceremony was to poison me over 6 months with low-dose aconitine so that I would die slowly of what would appear to be inherited heart failure, and then to seize control of the legal conglomerate of the Moretti family through a 14-year-old contingency clause I had the poor judgment not to reread when I signed it again. A dense wave of breath moved through the 300 guests. Elena parted her lips. Vincent lifted one hand. I have known everything since 3 in the morning 11 days ago. I have had 11 days to prepare. All of the evidence was delivered to the FBI 3 hours ago. He turned toward the small side stage. Sophia stepped out with a mobile projector. On the large screen mounted behind the marble altar, the very screen Elena had personally commissioned to display a wedding retrospective, 7 minutes of evidence began to play. The photograph of the Meridian Trust contract, the transfer of $1,200,000 from Meridian to Zurich, the images from the Plaza Suite, where Nathan had met Adrian 3 weeks earlier, the pharmaceutical order for aconitine, the falsified life insurance file, photographs of Elena in Zurich 4 years earlier standing beside Adrian and Dr. Reinhardt, and the audio recording of the 3 in the morning conversation, Elena's own voice carrying clearly through the hall's speakers. He trusts me completely. That's the entire point of the plan. Among the 20 bosses present, men who read evidence better than any lawyer alive, the entire story was understood by the 4th photograph that Nathan Cole rose from his seat several rows back and turned toward the side door. 2 men in white catering uniforms stepped in from either side. Within 3 seconds, Nathan was on the floor. No gunfire, no shout. Only the dry sound of a body pressed onto carpet. A pair of handcuffs appeared up from the 7th row. Agent Miriam Torres rose to her feet and lifted her FBI badge above her head. Adrian Blackwood didn't stand. He sat perfectly still, gazing up at the altar, at Vincent. For 20 seconds, the 2 men, one of 60, one of 39, looked at each other across 300 guests without a word. There was only the acknowledgement of the defeated by the victor, and the acknowledgement of the victor that he had come within days of being the defeated. Sophia and 4 agents walked down to the 4th row. Adrian rose slowly, leaning on his cane. He didn't resist. As he passed Elena, still standing beside the altar like a statue, he said only one sentence, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You did well, my dear. Only not well enough." Then he was walked away in handcuffs before 300 witnesses of the underworld that Elena began to cry. Not the crying of performance. It was the crying of a woman who had just understood that 4 years of her life had belonged to a man who had only ever viewed her as an instrument. The worst betrayal is not when someone deceives you. It is when you understand that the person you loved never existed, and the person to whom you owe your entire life is the one you never once looked at. 3 months later, Adrian Blackwood was indicted on 14 counts, including organized conspiracy to commit murder, international money laundering, financial manipulation, falsification of medical records, and participation in a criminal organization. The projected sentence was 25 years to life. At 60 years old, it was in effect a death sentence in slow motion. Nathan Cole became a federal witness, testifying against the entire Blackwood network in exchange for a reduced 12-year term. Elena Hart received 18 years. Her attorneys argued that she had been the subject of prolonged psychological training, a position Vincent quietly confirmed in a written statement. He didn't forgive her. He simply didn't want her to die inside a cell. Dr. Reinhardt was extradited from Zurich and sentenced to 15 years inside the Moretti mansion. Everything changed quietly. Grace, now the head housekeeper, had a small office beside the main study. She wore a tailored blazer to work each morning, supervised 32 staff members, and for the first time in her life kept a savings account she didn't need to hide from anyone. Lily had her own room on the second floor. Vincent had asked that it be painted sky blue, because that's where the birds live, and she loves the birds. She was 3.5 years old now. She attended a small private preschool nearby. Rocco drove her there every morning and picked her up every afternoon. She called Vincent Papa Vincent, not because anyone had told her to, but because one evening she had simply decided it, and Vincent had never corrected her. For the first time in 3 years, Vincent was seen to smile. It was a short smile, barely a movement of the mouth, but it happened one late afternoon in the garden when Lily climbed into his lap and pointed at a small brown sparrow perched on the low garden wall. The old gardener who saw it retold that moment for months afterward, as if it had been a small miracle in a mansion that had held 3 years of silence. There was now the laughter of a child every afternoon at 5 o'clock, but the lesson of this story is a simple one. Truth always finds its way to the surface, sometimes through the smallest and most innocent voices we usually overlook. Sometimes the one who saves us is not the strongest, the richest, or the wisest person in the room. It is a 3-year-old child who doesn't yet know what a secret means. It is a tired mother who finally chooses courage over silence. It is a moment at 3 in the morning when fate knocks on the door in a pair of woolen socks. Has there ever been a small thing in your own life that changed everything? An accidental sentence, a chance glance, a decision made at the right moment? Please leave a comment and tell me. I read every one of them. If this story touched your heart, please don't simply close the video. Press the like button so the algorithm can carry this story to someone who needs it. Share it with anyone in your life who may find something here. And subscribe to the channel if you want to hear real, deep, emotional stories like this every week. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I wish you a peaceful week, abundant health, joy in your ordinary days, and always enough courage to speak the truth when the world around you chooses silence. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.